Welcome to Hopkins at Home. I'm Fred Bronstein, Dean of the Peabody Institute here at Johns Hopkins, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's conversation. We're going to be speaking with the producer, director, and the star of the documentary, The Conductor, which recently debuted at the Tribeca Film Festival. So before I introduce our guest, I want to encourage you to ask any questions that you might have. You can go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and ask them that way. And so let me begin by introducing our very distinguished panel, beginning with Annette Porter, the producer of The Conductor. Annette left a career in strategy and communications to follow her passion for photography into the world of documentary films. She's the founder of Nylon Films, a factual content producer committed to storytelling from a female perspective, and the director of the Saul Zaentz Innovation Fund at Johns Hopkins University, which spearheads social entrepreneurship through film, awarding grants, and galvanizing industry support for young filmmakers. Bernadette Wagenstein, the director of The Conductor, is an Austrian-born documentary filmmaker and academic living in the United States. Her work brings together her feminist thought and her interest in human-centric storytelling. She studied semiotics with Umberto Eco, received her PhD in linguistics, and went to Stanford University for postdoc. She's currently a professor of media studies at Johns Hopkins University, where she directs the Center of Advanced Media Study. And she has directed 4 documentaries, including The Conductor and The Good Breast. Marin Alsop. Marin is an inspiring and powerful voice in the international music scene. She recently concluded her 14-year tenure as music director of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, which she began in 2007. She was of course the first woman to serve as music director of a major American orchestra. I know we'll talk a little bit about that today. She does continue as music director laureate in the years ahead with the Baltimore Symphony. Of course, as part of her artistic leadership in Baltimore, Marin was very involved in education, in community engagement, launching programs like Orchids and the BSO Academy and the Rusty Musicians program, all really geared to expose all ages to the world of classical music, or the world of music. Marin is also a professor at the Peabody Conservatory. She leads our graduate conducting program, and she is recently appointed chief conductor of the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra, and I believe also the first woman to sit in that chair, and the inaugural principal conductor at the Ravinia Festival. So as you can see, a very distinguished panel. And I'm just going to begin by launching in, and first of all, just noting what a beautiful film I think this is, and really beautifully, the subject is wonderful, and the film is beautifully made, very compelling, and I hope and assume you're getting a great response to it. I want to start by asking you a question, Marin, if I can. So sitting here today, some 15 years, or nearly 15 years since your appointment as music director to the BSO, what is the state of conducting as it pertains to women on the podium at this moment?
Yes, I think today we see a somewhat different landscape, although it was pretty static in terms of opportunities for women for, I'd say, the vast majority of my tenure during my time at the BSO. I would say in the last 4 years, 5 years at the most, we've seen an opening up of opportunity for women. And I would say that the major influence on that was the Me Too movement. I mean, it's sad to me that, an exposing of violence toward women creates opportunity for women. But in some way, I feel like, okay, but we need to take whatever opportunities there are. And I would say that um, really it's only even 2, 3 years ago, I met a lot of resistance when I wanted to feature women in the season in a substantive way. But now I feel that perhaps we passed that tipping point, Fred. I'm not sure. Only time will tell now whether we it's a process that is not no longer reversible, which I hope it is.
Right. Yeah. And do you find any distinction between what's happening in Europe around these or Asia as compared to the States?
I would say it's a similar situation that it's really just within the last few years that
Yep.
things have dramatically changed. In 2002, I started a fellowship for women conductors to try to create more and more opportunities for talented young women, especially to have the opportunity that our male counterparts have always had to fail and still get further opportunities. When you only have one chance, you stop taking risks, because you can't afford to blow it.
Yeah.
So I started a fellowship in 2002, and of the 24 recipients from 16 nationalities, currently 18 are music directors. So, and a lot of that has happened in just the recent past. So things are really starting to happen finally for women.
So, question for Bernadette, and actually for Annette as well. What drew you to the subject, to this subject? Was it music, Marin, uh, women's issues, conducting, all of the above? I mean, what made this compelling for you as a filmmaker or as filmmakers? Bernadette?
Well, I mean, I think definitely all of the above, but mainly Marin Alsop herself, because I wanted to, once I was interested in the topic of the missing canon of women conductors, which I came across really more or less accidentally by moving to Baltimore, listening to Marin at the BSO, and being extremely excited about having such a great orchestra in the city I just moved to, and realizing through her persona that she was really a very rare woman in this kind of position. I became interested in that topic, and Marin can tell a little bit more about how we met after that. But then, I think as a documentarian, you have to think about you're accompanying somebody now for years when you make a film about them, or when you just, embed yourself in their world. And you can only do that when you really, I think, obviously you can also be Michael Moore and make fun of people. But the kind of filmmaking that I appreciate and that I like to make is really kind of let a viewer experience the world of someone. I think it's really is really worthy of getting to know. And so as a result, it has to be somebody you're very excited about presenting to an audience. And that was certainly the case with Marin. Of course, the music interested me too, but we can get to that a little later, perhaps.
Annette, do you have a view on this?
I have similar interests. I first met Bernadette, and she told me about the great story about Marin. I had, of course, heard about Marin, and so for me, it was that combination of a compelling story being told by a really good storyteller. I couldn't resist. I was really excited to join the team. They'd already been working for a while before I joined up. Dan Cronin, our dean of finance at the time, introduced Berna and I, and we started very quickly. We realized that we would have a good working relationship.
And Marin, were you when you were early in the process, early in the project, were there moments when you weren't sure how the story was going to be told, or you were concerned about how the story was going to be told, or how it was going to come out? Were you nervous at all, or did you feel simpatico very early on? I mean, obviously you worked very well together as a result of the film, but how was that along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, yes, and yes. That I felt comfortable right away with Berna and her sensitivity and her understanding of the music as well, and her commitment to the music. That you don't want to work with someone who doesn't feel the profound depth of the art itself. And so that was the most important thing. And we went through a few iterations, of course, and I think it took, to tell an authentic story that feels honest and really where you feel vulnerable takes a lot of trust. And we did have to go through some different iterations to get it right. But I have to say that in the end, I never felt that Berna would force something that didn't feel authentic to me. And so she worked incredibly hard on the editing and re-editing and redoing of it a couple of times until it felt that it really resonated. And I can honestly say that I feel that this is a very, very genuine portrayal of my path in life.
And and what was that like in the sense of it's obviously intensely personal, and
Yes.
and I mean across your whole life, and I've known you a long time, and I've known you a long time, and I heard you say things in that were new to me. And what was that like for you?
Well, you seem to still be speaking to me, so I guess I'm okay. I think it was hard, Fred. I'm a very private person also, that's another aspect of this that was brand new to me. I do all the public appearances and everything, and you know, do a lot of that as part of my professional career. But when you start really having to uh, expose, I think without sharing what's been painful in life, it's very, very hard to share what's been joyful.
Yeah.
So it's important to find that place. And I think, that besides ending up with a beautiful film, I have to say that I think I hope I've grown as a human being to be able to feel that I can express some of the less positive aspects of the career path and still be safe. Staying safe when you're all alone in a career is a very challenging thing to feel. And I think also the fact that so many more women have now come into the field gives me hope for the future.
So I want to come back to that actually, but another question for Berna and Annette. Um, when you make a film, what I'm interested in, what dictates the structure. So one of the things that's really striking in this movie was you do a really beautiful job of weaving back and forth geographically, in time, and I mean it could have also been very disorienting, but in fact it just worked, I thought, beautifully. And it really struck me as like listening to a well-composed piece. So how do you make those decisions, and how did you formulate that particular approach for this film?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is very hard. Storytelling in documentary is very hard. And it's all about how you almost find yourself into it, how you start and you sort of go from there. But if you have a slightly bad entrance, you're not going to get there. It's not a forgiving art at all. It's and both of you are musicians, so you know exactly how it is. It's not too different from, let's say, a composition. So what happened is when I finally found the right way in, what I stuck with in my idea of the storytelling principle was with the essence of what I thought my character was about, or what I wanted to tell about this character, which is, yes, success, fame, the proms, everything, and this incredible musicianship. But I wanted always to remind the viewer every 5 minutes of the setback and what it takes, to get there. And I wanted us to be almost at the same time as we learn the next step, be reminded of what could have not, worked out. And so going back in time. And out of this wish, Stefan, our incredibly talented editor and himself a violinist, he created this narrative structure on the basis of, or we created it together in the editing room, on the basis of this question of the condensation, really, of the character's journey and on which journey we wanted to send her. And if you, and it has to be the same one as that you start with, you have to end with, and you can't just change path and in the middle say, oh, sorry, no, I wanted to. And so that's what's hard. And it took us a few times to be honest, to find that. But I always knew, one thing I can say about storytelling is in documentary is, the truth is always the best way to go. And film is a medium that is very revealing of truth. It's not forgiving. Like it'll show the essence of your face. You can put on makeup and everything, but it'll show something. And I love that about film, that it is so revealing, because I'm a very extroverted person. I love everything to be revealed and out in the open. But again, you have to be truthful to your story and who your character is. And that's why we created this structure that's almost like 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, also in time.
That's so interesting, actually, because that it reinforces, that so much of what is emotional about the film, right? And from Marin's perspective and the experience, and that anything you would, I know your role is a little bit different, but what, how do you see the whole structural question and finding the right?
It was really interesting watching the structure develop. I think one of the things that you hit upon also, from the beginning, Berna had in her mind that the music was a character in the film, and I think, watching it develop, it was like a score was being written, a new piece of music, if you will. And she studied the music very carefully, and with the love and knowledge of music between Marin and Berna, it really started evolving. And so there is this, if you were simply to listen to the musical score in the film, you would be taken on a journey itself, a journey of Marin's life. And I think that was really important. And I also, I think this staying true to the challenges. And I think sometimes in stories that are uplifting and powerful, people forget to talk about the cost of success. And it cost Marin a lot to achieve what she did. And I think that comes through in the film. And I think that's important for people setting out. It's not always easy. It's mostly not easy.
So I want to remind folks that are listening in to feel free to ask questions. We will get to them a little bit later in the program. Go to the Q&A and you can ask your questions there. So Marin, you really have spent much of your career defying the odds, and sometimes, frankly, under ugly circumstances. Where does that perseverance and belief come from? I mean, I know you to be a very persistent person. And I mean,
not sure what that means, but yes.
No, it's a great thing, actually. It's but boy, when I watched this and I saw you as a young woman and what you were trying to do, and at a time when people weren't doing it and at all, let alone the infrequent aspects still of it today, I'm kind of amazed at. I mean, I'm not, but because I know you, but what was that like for you? And I guess, part of me is like, I want every one of our students to see this film, because not just because it's your story, but because I think, as you know, and we know, this field takes such perseverance, no matter what circumstances are. And, I think there's a fantastic lesson in that. You couldn't get anybody to give you what you wanted. I'm going to go create it myself. And I mean, I just think that's it's such a compelling story. But I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about sort of Where does that all come from? I mean, for you, where do you think it comes? If you know,
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, part of it is probably just, I was just born stubborn, I mean, I'm, I'm the offspring of two very stubborn people. And, or maybe stubborn isn't the right word, sort of, um, people who don't understand that you're not supposed to be able to do everything. I grew up in a household, my parents were professional musicians, but they also were dreamers. So my dad, when they finally cobbled together enough money to buy a tiny little house in Westchester, which is where I grew up after we moved from Manhattan, my father said one day, we really need a cathedral ceilinged concert hall on our house. We had this tiny, I mean, the house was just a little salt box house. And so, he didn't know how to build anything, but he bought a piece of property next door and dug a big hole. And for the next 5 years, figured out how to build this thing. It was that kind of um, can do. And then my mother decided, oh, pottery. I have to become a potter. And so I have my entire, dishware is made by my mother. It's this kind of thing that, and I would just sit there and think, oh, you're never going to be able to do this. And then lo and behold, they would somehow manage to figure things out. I'm not saying it was perfect always, but where, I guess that expression that where there's a will, there's a way was the what I grew up watching and observing. And having performers as parents, you learn early on that no matter what's going on, the show must go on, and you have to have a positive outlook and show up and perform. And that's, in some ways, I think that was really a defining feature for me. And then, what happens is you become attached to the idea that when people tell you you can't do something, that you need to show them that you can. So that became a part of who I am too.
yeah. Well, it's amazing, and it really is it's just a great example. I think that particularly, as I said, for folks that are coming up in this field.
I think, Fred, that the film, it's great to hear that, you have that sense that we want all of the Peabody students to see the film, because I think your vision for Peabody, which is creating the 21st century, musician, citizen, artist, is hopefully part of that message.
Yeah.
That we can define our future. We can define the future of our industry. And I hate to use that word, of our art, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really part of I think your governing philosophy about what the future holds for musicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely it is, and I think that's why it feel it's that's why I want them to. Well, I want them to see it because I think it's a wonderful film, but I think they can learn. They can take an awful lot away from it in terms of what it takes. So we've kind of touched on the musical part of the film, but obviously music is at the core of all of this, and I'm interested in maybe talking a little bit more about the choices that were made around that, in both, on the filmmaker side, but also on your side, Marin. I know a lot of these, the music that's featured is certainly music that you're very close to, whether it's Copland or American music or contemporary music and Mahler. And so that all comes through. But, aside from issues of availability and things like that, how did you think about sort of what you wanted people to hear in the film musically? And that's really for the panel.
Well, maybe I can start and then Berna can pick up. I think the fact that the first thing that the team filmed was Mahler 1 at Peabody. I think that really led us off in a certain direction. And of course, Mahler was so important to my mentor, Leonard Bernstein. And of course, Mahler figures so prominently in my new city here, and there in Vienna. Berna's actually in Vienna right now. I was there on Saturday. So I think that sort of took us and seemed so gripping, didn't it, Berna? That and
Absolutely.
go ahead, you take over.
No, I mean, look, Marin, of course, she just sent me her calendar the other day because a lot of festivals that we're invited to want to have her there in presence. And so I see, 3 days here, 4 days there. It's incredible how she travels. And it was no different when we've produced. And so she presented me with a calendar. Yes, we started with Mahler's first in Baltimore. Because I wanted to film, the students at work, because I always knew, that was one of the key sub narratives, learning how to conduct. But then, I just chose at times very intuitively when I heard she was doing Mozart in Sao Paulo, the Magic Flute, which was the first opera I ever went to when I was 5 here in Vienna. I said, that's going to give me something. I don't know what it is, but I want that. But for the rest, I have to say with the Mahler, I was very happy about it because I always wanted to know more about Mahler. And one of your students, Alexa Rin, was my tutor for almost 2 years, and I really went in with the score. I said, I don't want to be a musician, but I want to read this score with you. And she said, okay. So we did that. And I wouldn't have done it for somebody else, I would say. I really thought that Mahler would really fit in well with a theme that, I just want to say we've been invited to so many Jewish film festivals, and there's such a strong Jewish content in the music in this film. And it was something that I was also very happy that it came together this way. And it was curated this way too, and in the end we did Copeland in Baltimore, and I wanted to have Mass in there. And I thought that the composers that we chose represented to a certain extent also the struggle of being an outsider in a apparatchik establishment situation, and that's why we used, the Bernstein clips of Das ist kein Maler, I mean, these little things, they all are connected in the same theme, and that's about the musical choices. But then how we, cut them together, that was a whole other story, because you need to create a bed for a film. And yes, Mahler became that, we call it a bed, in editing. So the first symphony became that. And then it was really, at times really going with Marin's beautiful cadence and voiceover narrative, and often looking for certain phrases in certain compositions that sort of spoke to how she said something. I mean, this is how we were really digging around, it was very deeply, we went very deep, but all the music is performed by Marin and means something to her. And that was also another reason why we chose it. Yeah, so I loved that musical journey, and I will never forget it. It's probably the most fulfilling thing I've ever learned at an at an advanced age, I have to say. It's not something that you normally do. It's like learning ancient Greek in your retirement.
So Annette, your thoughts on the musical component of this?
I too, I mean, as I said earlier, it was such a journey for me to go on and to listen to the music. And I love the Lehrer Albach at the end. So it's also bringing right around to new female composers, contemporary composers. So it really ran the full gamut. And I'll share with you something. We had 2 showings at Tribeca, and the second one being in the far reaches of Brooklyn. And there were people playing baseball nearby, and there were scooters, and there were bicycles. And what I had learned working with Berna and Marin was really from for his music and what inspired him. And it felt like the most fitting place to be showing all around us. There were people on the blanket, they were in their folding chairs. It was part of day-to-day life. And so for me, it had been quite an education too. But I sort of
So we're having a little trouble hearing you, Annette. I think you may be frozen. So we'll come back and let you finish that.
Fred, just to recap a little bit, that I think what Berna and Annette are both referencing is this idea that also that classical music is not an ivory tower, an inaccessible ivory tower, but rather, um, you know, it- it's human, and that everyone should have the door open wide for them to come in. And I think that's an important part of the musical choices as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So we've touched a little bit on education, students in the movie. And there is quite a bit of footage in the film of your teaching your Peabody students, Marin. And I have to say that I would just share that Marin was actually the first faculty member that I hired at Peabody in my tenure here. Yeah, there we go. I set a high bar. And she replaced actually a legendary conducting teacher, Gustav Meyer, who you, I believe, also studied.
Who was my teacher? Yeah.
And Marin, you've continued obviously to build a really, I would say, not just an outstanding conducting program, but a diverse conducting program. And why is that? And we're diverse, obviously beyond women, but to conductors of color also. And why is that? That's very important to me and to Peabody. And why is that important to you? And the other thing I guess I want to ask you is what do you think is the most important thing, if you could name one thing in terms of teaching conducting? What would that be?
Sure. Well, let me start with the question of diversity on the podium. I think that it goes to the question of opportunity first and foremost. That I'm just a believer fundamentally that every single human being should have the same opportunity as the person standing or sitting next to them. That just because one is born with fewer resources, for example, or one is born in a certain location, shouldn't be any barrier to the opportunities one receives. And then the second issue is an issue of leadership. The conducting role it's a role about leadership, and it's not just about conducting. Conducting is a huge part of it, of course, but a huge part of conducting is also about leading people and and being an inspiration, being a galvanizing force. And I believe that it's really important to experience a diversity of leadership in order to have a complete um, art. And I'm not a believer that, well, if we all come from the same economic background and we all look the same, that our art is then going to be better. I believe that by bringing people from different backgrounds with different experiences, we will create the richest tapestry possible. Um, and also, of course, I think as someone who was denied access and denied opportunity for so many years, I am really I am in a position to champion others who have been denied that opportunity. So, it's a passion of mine. I think the fact that my colleague at Peabody, whom you also hired, Joseph Young, was the first young conductor in the role of the Peabody BSO Fellow. And, the fact that today he is head of the ensemble program at Peabody and, and the music director of the Berkeley Symphony, it blows my mind because it's a completion of a circle. And this is very, very important to me. Also, people often speak about the future of classical music. If we don't involve people from these diverse groups, there will be no future. I mean, there'll be no future, period, but certainly no future for classical music. And when I see the kids in orchids playing their instruments and listening to a concert, they are the people that are going to appreciate and carry on this tradition. And they're so enthused about it too.
Yep.
That's
Yeah.
what's great.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And you're right. I mean, the whole thing about the field, I mean, it really is, I like to say it's an existential question to the field, because it is about the future. It's about changing demographics. And if you're going to expand audience, there's only one way to do that, and that's by diversifying the audience. And that means
Right.
diversifying everybody who's involved in this field. So we are coming up on a time where we'll take a few questions. I want to, before I do that, I do want to just come back to, Leonard Bernstein is obviously in this film and important in this film. And why was Bernstein so important to you in your career, aside from the fact that he obviously saw something in you that was significant, and that he thought highly enough of to want to spend time with you and help you? But from your perspective, what is it that you took away from the interactions you had with him?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that it's almost hard to articulate. But I would say, on a very personal level, I think the sense that he valued me. He valued my artistry. And when you have a teacher and a mentor and a hero who, doesn't necessarily literally say that, although he did occasionally say it, and then he would say something rude afterward, always to counterbalance it. But I think that gives a young person a sense of self. I think the greatest gift he gave me was the gift to believe in myself.
Mhm.
And this is what I try to give every student I have, that the knowledge that we are all unique. I mean, it's such a simple concept, of course, but I find often that teachers forget how much impact they can have on a student with one sentence, with one phrase. And it's important, of course, to be tough with them, but it's more important to give them a sense of possibility. That's our role as teachers, I believe, is to to inspire and bring out the best. I mean, I think that's the role of a great conductor. A great leader is someone that can bring out the best in the people around them. And Bernstein did that. He would walk into a room. I'll never forget, I read, there was a list of the 10 greatest orchestras in the world. Number one was any orchestra Leonard Bernstein is conducting. So the idea is that, I would sometimes rehearse an orchestra for him in anticipation of his coming a couple days later. And really, he walked in the room and they got 50% better. Nothing happened. He just walked in because he had that charisma. He had that, legendary
Gravitas.
status. Yeah, gravitas. And he was also curious. He was always learning. I think that's a really important. He never said my way is the only way. That's it. He would go into a rehearsal and say, I've been thinking about this Fifth Symphony of Tchaikovsky. I've been thinking about it incorrectly all these years. I have a new idea. And sometimes the ideas were wacky, but here was someone who really gave it some thought. And he would read a book, maybe a philosophical text, and he would come back and say, I've rethought this now, based on some new information I have from another. So this interdisciplinary, that everything's connected, and also, he didn't necessarily say it, but he lived it. he was one of the first true artist citizens.
Yeah.
He stood up for what he believed in. He wrote about it. He lived it. He put his money where it was, and that was great to watch. And I try to instill that in my students also. At least, you can't insist that people do things for society, but you can set an example.
There's also this rarity that just, I mean, the scope of his musical
Yeah,
life
that too.
was, it's crazy. I mean, how many people achieve that? That's a whole other conversation. So, some questions from our listeners today. We'll start with this. Maestra, how did your experience directing the swing band shape you differently as a conductor? And there are a number of questions asked by the same person. Why don't you start with that?
That's a fantastic question though, actually, and not one that people often ask me,
Mhm.
because they think of the two things as very separate lives, but actually probably playing in in my swing band was probably the more formative experience I had, maybe even than going to Juilliard, because first of all, from a musical point of view, I learned so much about rhythm and impulse and improvisation and perfection and groove and feel and all these things that were, I can't even really itemize them because there's so many. But another aspect was that, I never forget the first night we played at a jazz club in New York, and I went with my prepared hello listeners to the first song we're going to, and everybody was, you know a few drinks in, and click, they were like, okay, so listen lady, why don't you just be quiet and play your music already? And I realized, okay, this is a different kind of setting, and I have to start to try to be loose. So, you know playing in a jazz club every week really started my path down the started me down the path of speaking extemporaneously to audiences and managing situations and communicating, and not getting all bent out of shape when someone coughs in a concert, or a few months in a jazz club really cures you of all that. So, I think on many levels it was fantastic. And also, when we started, we were 14 women, and having that solidarity um, of purpose. And you see in the film, of course, that we're still, and they were all at the premiere too. When it premiered at Tribeca a few weeks ago, we're still totally connected, and that's so important as we go through life. Just on a human level, to have people that have your back.
So, another question. There are many things to commend about this film. How long did it take to make it? Where will this be shown? At any festival? Any plans for DVD streaming? Berna? Annette?
I will talk about the length, and then Annette can tell you where she's going to be. I mean, I think it actually didn't take that long, about 4 years all in all, including the development of it. So, which is not very long for a documentary. It's a good amount. And it took about a year to develop it, to get to know the character and the stories, to decide on the music and the production schedule. And then about 2 years to produce it and to actually, make it, including fundraising and all that. And then about a year and a little more to edit it.
Now I'm going to hope that my internet connection is a bit more stable now. Can you hear me?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of where we can see it, it's following a fairly traditional rollout, and that the first places it will be seen are in festivals. It's had its US premiere. It's going to have its Asian premiere. It's rolling around the world, and then it'll be in festivals in the US. And at the same time, we have a sales agent on board who's talking to distributors and platforms about where it will live and where it will find a home commercially. Now, with all of those conversations, we're hoping also to have a theatrical run before it goes into a mass distribution. because in part because it's a personal film, and Marin has wonderful audiences in several different cities. So even a theatrical run that's geared towards these special cities that may have a relationship with orchids or that may have a relationship with the local symphony, we want to try to do it in conjunction with that on the rollout.
Mhm.
I think that there's a link embedded also here where you can follow the trajectory of the film. We've got a newsletter that goes out to tell you when and where you can see it.
Yeah,
Great.
so on our website, Fred, the website, the film's website, the-conductor.com, you can leave your email and then we will tell you where the film is playing. We have a few announcements already where it's going to play in Korea, and we have several festivals, I think 6 or 7 in the US in the fall, but we can only ever announce them about 2 weeks before the festivals start. But there are several in Florida, there's one in Utah, and there's one in Colorado and California. So Arizona, it'll play around the United States. So this is about 1 year or so of a festival run, right, Annette?
Yes, things are getting more compressed in this market and even more so after COVID, but probably 9 months to a year before it will move out of the festival run.
So another question while we're talking about sort of the on the filmmaker side, this is also for Marin as well, were there things that you loved that had to be left out of the film because they didn't fit? And what is that like, actually? You must see stuff that you kind of fall in love with as material, but then it doesn't work in the film and you have to give it up and all that kind of stuff.
Of course. And knowing me, I fall for things very fast because, and then, but for instance, Mary was telling the story of her parents and of the father building this cathedral house. And we had even archival images of this. And just to give you an example, I was in love with the story. And Stefan and I actually had an edit, Marin, one day we will show you, where we actually wove that in, because she did tell me about this in one of the interviews. And so we had footage to tell the story. But there was something for us to tell, the person who asked this great question, that told us that from a storytelling perspective, it was taking us too far out of the core of what our story was trying to tell us, because we had a little bit about her relationship and we knew it was a very important relationship with her parents from the beginning of the film on. But then if you come back to something like that, you have to then resolve it with something. And we didn't want to do that because it was her story and not her parents' story. So these are very difficult decisions to make. And I loved this story because I think it says so much about her perseverance, as you just asked her before, and the way that she was socialized. And it's a fun story, and the photos were fun too. Yet we had to let it go, but I'm happy about it because I was happy to stay focused on what my story was to tell.
Well, it's so interesting, Fred. These questions also are terrific. The way this film started was completely different. It emerged from an experience I had meeting a woman who's in her 80s now, named Sylvia Kaduf. And I met her in Lucerne, and I didn't know her. I didn't know her name. And then someone said, "Don't you know who she is?" And I said, "No, I'm sorry. I have no idea. I've never heard of her." And it turned out she was the first woman to conduct the Berlin and New York Philharmonics. And she was Bernstein's assistant conductor after she won the Metropolis competition in 1966.
Mhm.
And I didn't know her name. I mean, what kind of
Mm.
world are we living in where women's stories are not preserved and
Mhm.
not helped? So this was the germ that got the project going. And so I went back to Lucerne with a little video team from Berlin just to do an interview with Sylvia. And that's how I got connected to Berna, because I was chatting with President Ron Daniels about this experience. And he said, "Well, you should maybe try to connect with a film person here." And that's how it all started, really. And then, of course, we don't even see Sylvia until the end credits. but we got her in there.
Parents. Well, while you have the floor, Marin, is there anything you learned about yourself when watching the film?
Oh gosh, anything I learned about myself. Oh, that a lot of times, those 10 pounds really should come off, and
Oh my God.
and I need more sleep, maybe. Those kind of things that as I'm watching, I'm thinking, oh boy. No, I guess the thing that strikes me, it's just a very personal thing, and it's the way I'm able to tell that the time has passed. That our son Auden, um, looks so young in the film. The little clip, in 3 years, he's changed so much, and I guess you just realize that, you know, life is very precious, and it passes by very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for this chance to share my story and hopefully inspire other people not to give up.
Another question. So in the film, Marin mentions breaking down students to build them up. How is Peabody reimagining training in new ways? So
That's a question for you, Fred.
For you.
I think that I mean the way I would simply, not to take up a lot of time with that question, but it is an important question, is to say that, look, I think that the core things that one needs to develop to become an outstanding artist, whatever the discipline might be, hasn't changed. I mean, in terms of the craft and all of the things that you need to do. But I think what has changed is everything that surrounds that. And so when you think about what it means to communicate, what it means to be in the business of developing audience, and not that isn't the purview of somebody else. That's actually the role and the job of every artist. What does it mean to find creative ways to develop and pursue a career? What does it mean to be competent digitally, in a digital world?
Right.
I mean, all of these things and much more, I think, are the kinds of things that when we think about preparing artists, for the future, I think are so important. But to me, it's not so much about the skills, because I think people can learn the skills. It's about changing mindset, because artists are trained, to think very sort of, you're very focused on what you're doing. You're very focused. You're very driven. But I think there needs to be room to, for a more holistic approach, and understand what it means to be part of the ecosystem, actually, and to be part of developing the ecosystem that's going to sustain the art. And I think that's a big difference from, maybe the way people saw this 50 years ago. Maybe it isn't, I don't know, but I think it's to me, it's an obvious important track in all of this. Marin, I know you've thought a lot about this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I hope that those that really does define the old days, and that approach is over. I think that has, I don't know if it's in other disciplines as well, but I imagine that concept of sort of destroying someone and rebuilding them in your image is one that's probably consistent with a certain kind of pedagogy, or a certain kind of personality. I I imagine that, but I just think that's so wrong and so destructive. And I hope that I hope that what we can do is create an environment where students can be the best version of themselves and
Yeah.
feel validated. And I think that, Fred, you and I share that approach. And that requires reevaluation all the time, constant reevaluation. Well, can we change? And evolution too. We have to, we're in an industry that hates evolution. We like to do the same pieces, the same over and over. We like to do it the same way. This is the way, wear the same clothes,
Yeah.
you know, and it's time to let things move forward. But
Yeah.
it's a hard industry to convince.
Yeah, yeah, we're an industry that likes our tradition, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of wonderful things about tradition, but we have to think. I mean, it's a very different world, and the world continues to evolve, and we need to, and evolve with that. And I think for me, it's most about, and this isn't just for artists. This is about artistic institutions. Creating institutions that are much more flexible and adaptable and nimble, maybe
Mhm.
than they have historically been. So I think we have time for a couple more questions, just a few minutes left. I remember a movie I saw a film years ago made by Judy Collins about Antonia Brico. Are you familiar with her work? Were there other documentaries that influenced you?
Me, I don't know this documentary. No.
I actually do remember that from years ago. I don't know if you remember it, Marin.
Yes, I know of this film. It's interesting. I I now that the viewer mentions the film, I'm really super curious about going back and having a look at it. Um, I met Antonia Brico um, very briefly because she sponsored a violinist who worked with my parents. They were from the same region, and so I met her. Um, and she scared the bejeebies out of me. She was really like a tough lady. And I I know that Judy Collins, now I'm not sure how they met, but Antonia Brico ended up in Denver.
Yeah.
And so I think they met somewhere in that region. But I to be honest, I think I saw the film once, but it's been so long that I'm very curious now that it's mentioned to go back and have a look at it. Do you know that film, Annette? Are you familiar with it?
I am not familiar with it either. I'm sorry to say, but like you, I'm also curious now. Thanks for this question because it's just been added to my list of films I need to go see.
I saw it like 40 years ago, and I remember seeing it, but I don't, I too would be curious to go back and see it now, sort of in the context of all of this. So another question: who are Ms. Alsop's favorite composers and conductors other than Leonard Bernstein?
Oh, I think we're going to run out of time for me to list all of those, but oh, there's so many wonderful conductors. I mean, my dear friend Bernard Haitink is at the top of the list. He's a dear friend, wonderful conductor, and there's so many terrific younger conductors that I adore listening to as well, and um, respect tremendously. And then when you think about composers, I mean, the list is way too long, but um, I do think that for me, it all starts with Brahms and emanates outward from that because Brahms is the first composer that I remember being understanding that music could move you. You know how you're a kid and you just do it because you play because you're good at it. And then suddenly you have this, absolute revelation that music has this power to change our emotions or to capture our emotional state. And that was really, and for me, that was Brahms. So I always start there.
Yeah, yeah. Good choice. Um, what parallels? I think we could do one more question. We've got about a minute or 2 minutes left. What parallels do you see for increasing opportunity for women in the orchestra and on the podium?
What parallels?
Yeah.
You mean in other fields?
Um,
I wonder.
I think he might be asking about coming into the orchestra. I read it as coming into the orchestra versus being on the podium. And as we know, at least in American orchestras, they're way ahead in terms of playing in the orchestra. American orchestras are 50% women, 50% plus women.
But Fred, it's still what's sort of interesting is that there's still these stereotypes about certain instruments.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because women, now we see the horn section being much more diversified in terms of gender, but it's very rare to see women in the brass department and the percussion too. It's still a bit rare.
Yeah.
And also as leaders of sections. That's not so. I think there's still a ways to go in terms of the top. It's the same thing with conductors. To get, we see a lot more women, but at the top, now that I'm stepping down in Baltimore, there will be no woman leading a major American orchestra, and actually there'll be no American leading a major American orchestra. So, there are a lot of stereotypes that continue to perpetrate.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and but it is reassuring to see American orchestras, at least. I mean, I noted, because I was curious. I was looking it up the other day, that I think in Berlin now, and it's come a long way, but the Berlin Philharmonic still only has, I want to say, 17 women in it out of 125 players. Vienna Philharmonic, I think, I want to say it's maybe, I don't even know if it's that, actually. I think maybe it's 15 players. I don't. It's a low number, so it's something to think about. Interesting. With that, I think we are at the end of our time. What a great panel, and thank you, Marin and Bernadette and Annette, and what a wonderful film. And so you can go to, it's theconductor.com. Do I have that right? So
Yes,
yep.
and we can. It's the
Conductor.com.
The-conductor.com.
I think that's what it is.
Oh, there it is.
You can go and you can get more information about the film and where it's being shown. And we hope to see you again at Hopkins at Home. And thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.